Holland Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello everyone and welcome back to our Beyond Compliance podcast series, unpacking all things that leaders are grappling with when it comes to workplace disruption. Today's world is particularly challenging with the adaptation of AI, global conflicts, supply shortages, and increased flexibility that employees are now expecting. There's a lot to juggle and big questions to be answered, the most important being, how do we lead through these challenges? I'm Faye Calderoni, a partner in our employment team and co-lead of the Beyond Compliance offering for boards and executives, and I'm delighted to be your host for this podcast series. Today, I am so pleased to be joined by my colleagues and fellow partners, Emily Harvey and Susie Leask. Emily is my talented partner in our employment and safety team based in Brisbane, who also notably has invaluable experience navigating workplace transformation in-house in a global resources company. Susie is a partner in our corporate and commercial team, my co-lead of our Beyond Compliance offering, and has specialist expertise in technology procurement, AI, intellectual property, and assisting boards and directors in relation to corporate governance and regulatory compliance. Having had the privilege of working with Susie with a lot of our largest clients, I can confirm she is the best in the business, and we are so lucky to have both Emily and Susie joining us today. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks so much, Faye.
Great to be here.
Glad to have you. It's no secret that we're living in turbulent times. We've got global unrest, economic uncertainty, fears that AI is going to steal our jobs. There's plenty to be alarmist about, and I've also noticed there's a lot of fear permeating in our workplaces and communities. The headlines aren't just worrying employees, they're also worrying employers. In the face of this, the big questions do really become, how do leaders confront and address these challenges whilst also building trust, high performance, increasing efficiencies, increasing productivity? We've got international clients under pressure in terms of Australian operations. There's so much going on, but we need to stay positive and we need to have practical tips and hope. And I hope that's what we get out of this podcast series and this discussion today. So I'm going to kick off with Susie. We're seeing a lot of momentum around this, with many businesses adopting AI to maximise productivity and reduce costs. But how do organisations, boards and leaders govern the use of this take-up?
Thanks, Faye. And I agree, there's so much happening that business leaders have to grapple with, and AI is just one of those many challenges that we're certainly seeing boards and management of businesses really shift that conversation from understanding what AI is to that implementation and risk management stage, which means sometimes piloting different AI platforms and testing use cases, figuring out what your business can use it for in a meaningful way to get those productivity gains or returns on investment, while also navigating AI governance and putting in place some of those guardrails and risk mitigation strategies as well. Because the reality is, as you, Emily and Faye would both know, staff are using AI, whether business owners, leaders, boards know it or not. So you really do have to not stick your head in the sand. As the ASIC chair, Joe Longo, said earlier this year, every board has to have that conversation about AI use and determine their risk appetite and set their policies, rather than turning a blind eye to the issue and hoping it all sorts itself out. So to answer your question, Faye, in terms of governing the use and take up of AI, organisations have to start with the basics. Write the rule book for AI use and think about what your organisation's AI risk appetite actually is. And that's going to vary for each business depending on the type of data you hold, whether that's personal information, sensitive or health information, your customer base and stakeholder expectations. You might have government contracts or other restrictions on the use of AI. And also think about how you're going to lock down and protect your confidential information, trade secrets, intellectual property, and in some cases, just maintain legal privilege over legal advice. So it's not put into some of those open AI platforms like ChatGPT, for example, where privilege can be waived and valuable company information is disclosed and then it's in the public domain. So practically, what does that actually mean? As you say, we want to be positive in terms of what businesses should be doing. Start by developing your company's AI use policies and procedures to cover all those risk topics like confidentiality, personal sensitive information, IP, managing also some of those inaccuracies of AI responses, dealing with the attribution and use of AI tools. So being transparent and keeping our people accountable when they are using AI, and thinking about that in terms of the interaction with employee obligations, including whether a breach can give rise to a right to terminate for misconduct, and also AI incident response policies and procedures, because people are still learning, right? So it's a matter of not if but when someone will breach your AI use policies, and being able to respond quickly in the event of a potential data breach is so important. And I think just from a
to jump in there, that my brain just had the thought that it's so true. I remember that when social media was introduced, there was a lot of businesses that didn't have social media policies, and then we had this huge uptick of businesses obviously implementing social media policies. And it's always about what you can do and what you can't do, and what are the consequences if it goes wrong, and what happens to your employment as an employment lawyer when it does go wrong. But I remember that we evolved so quickly to you should have a social media policy to case law almost automatically going, in this day and age, how can a business not have a social media policy? And how can you expect employees to know if you don't tell them what to do or what they can and can't do? And the Linfox case that I'm thinking of that very quickly became a precedent case for social media policies, then resulted in another huge uptick of people introducing social media policies. But I suppose the point is, you don't want to be the company that gets criticised by a regulator or a court for not having the policy, right?
That's exactly right. And I think that's the biggest challenge that businesses are dealing with, is it's all happening all at once. The law is lagging, the case law is catching up, and you're absolutely right. You don't want to be that test case, which is why we're applying some of those same principles, right? Like prevention is better than cure, which is why that focus on guardrails is so critical, but also the technical control mechanisms from a technology perspective. So things like locking down your IT systems or your data or your information. So you're thinking about how people are using mobile phones to prevent that use of public AI platforms, investing in closed system AI tools that are just on your system. And some organisations are even developing internal protocols around AI use cases and use case review committees to think about how that's implemented in practice. And of course, training is key, as with anything we talk about in the cyberspace, as the human firewall being the biggest risk to your business. And the same thing can be said in relation to AI, and setting those limits is really important. But I think data governance is also the other practical space that people need to pay attention to. We talk about garbage in, garbage out in the context of AI platforms, so having quality data, but also really knowing what you hold and whether it contains personal information and therefore shouldn't be in AI platforms, and updating your privacy policy accordingly to get the relevant consents for what you might be planning to do. And then flowing that down to any third parties that you might be using from a technology contracting perspective, because this is about risk management. So yes, from a staff perspective, we want them trained, to your point, Faye, about social media policy, equivalent analogies. We also want to think about our external providers and where they might be the human in the loop that's the risk, or the organisation that could potentially be subject to a data breach. So really getting those tech contracts right, understanding how the technology works, managing those risks, putting in place anything the sales team tells you that platform does or doesn't do. Yes, it'll definitely stay on your system. Can we have a warranty to indemnity to that effect? And just really making sure that your board policies as well about the oversight and use of AI is in place as well from that next level up. So not just operationally, but how is your board using AI as that conversation shifts to, should we be using AI to help us govern, and is that safe? And that's a whole other topic as well.
It's a topic I wanted to ask you about, actually. So very good, smart segue. In terms of boards and AI governance, are there trends that you're seeing? How are they managing these risks? Do we have a continuum of organisations, as I expect we may, where early adopters and others that are really lagging behind? And what do you think the consequences of that could be?
Yeah, I think the challenge is everyone's playing catch up a little bit and trying to get across it, trying to figure out how best to use it and what their risk appetite is specific to that organisation. And at a board level, when we think about our director duties of care and diligence, we've seen actually regulators comment on this really recently. They've done some open letters to industry from both ASIC and APRA. ACMA has also commented from that communications and media perspective, which really has firmly and publicly put AI in the frame of director duties of care and diligence, saying that is a director responsibility to be across it, to govern it, to monitor it, to have appropriate systems and processes in place, just like all your other risks. And I think how the board's using AI is very diverse, but I suspect where you have external directors, independent directors, people use their own AI platforms as well. And so think about that in terms of a big board pack you get. You're preparing for a board meeting. You might not have a lot of time. You're using AI to summarise, to ask key questions. You cannot possibly say that you've exercised your duty of care and diligence by just relying on an AI-generated summary if you have not interrogated the entire board pack materials. And that's the commentary that's coming through from the regulators. I think we'll see some case law around this point. I also think the board minute and transcripts and those sort of tools that people are using in the boardroom is really tricky. Thinking back, if you go to royal commissions, when all of those directors were cross-examined, imagine that in the context of having an AI-generated transcript, particularly where AI then generates a summary that can also read the sentiment in the room and comment on people's body language and mood and how you want that represented. But also, what does that do to stifle open and robust debate around the boardroom table? So that's a whole other world in terms of risk management in the boardroom. I also think when you look at the Corps Act proper, if we're talking about delegation and reliance and business judgment rule defences, we can't delegate to AI. AI is not a person. We can't rely on AI, and we certainly can't blindly rely on AI output because of the black box problem. And what that means is your tech people can't even tell you how AI really works. So how can you have possibly interrogated that output to understand exactly why AI has come to that conclusion and therefore exercise that independent judgment and verification skills that a director's inquiring mind is required to have?
Fabulous. Oh my goodness, so much to unpack there and so much talk about AI and robots. I'm going to move over to Emily because she's going to talk to us about all things people and most importantly, how this impacts our people in the workplace. And we've talked a little bit about policies and training, but how do we manage this implementation of AI and how's it really going to affect our people and work?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. That's a really great question. So we've had a lot of focus on the take-up of AI and partnerships and platforms, but we haven't heard a lot about the implementation phase, and that's really where it's going to hit our people. So assuming we're talking about introducing AI to workflows, so that workers will need to start using AI day to day, they'll need training and support to use those tools, and quite possibly there may be some reluctance. So employers should really think carefully about how to manage this change, adopting a deliberate communication strategy to ensure that workers understand what's happening and why, and can be appropriately consulted about changes to their role or team or the impacts on them. And for some workers, the impacts might be really small. It might be, for example, using a program to keep a file note of conversations instead of handwriting a note. But for others, tasks might be really significantly impacted. So in those cases, we probably need to start thinking about whether the position itself is changing. For example, take someone who might have had a relatively administrative client intake role, where this then becomes automated. Their role might suddenly become more of a client relationship role or a managerial role, where they're the client touch point, and then they might have many more clients. So in cases like this, implementation is less straightforward. It might be necessary to think about whether that old role no longer exists. Is it a redundancy scenario? And then work through that process and a consultation process. So while roles can certainly change or duties can change, we can also see new roles organically arising. And I think that presents a different challenge as well.
Yeah, I think the impacts on workforce people roles are going to be undeniable. We're already seeing some of that play out in the media with announcements of mass redundancies. And I think that the big challenge, and I'm talking to clients about it, is that I call it the just right principle, not too heavy, not too light, avoiding death by 1,000 cuts, which causes people to look over their shoulder and constantly be wondering what's next, but then not too fast that it catches people by surprise, and managing psychosocial through that. So I think that's really where I'd like to take you to next, if I can. And I know it's a really hard one, but how do employers manage this uptake of AI and the undeniable impact from AI while still building trust in the workplace, engagement, and positive workplace cultures, and most importantly, safe workplace cultures where people feel they can still show up and be okay at work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really tough question where, as Susie mentioned earlier, it's all happening so fast to businesses. So they don't really know necessarily what the future holds, what the shape of work might look like, and what the shape of the workforce will look like. So I think there's a huge piece of uncertainty there, and that can certainly flow on to employees who will undoubtedly have some concerns about their roles, the shape of their team, the roles of colleagues. And I think in that sense, the most that employers can do from the outset is attempt to be really transparent in how they're using AI, what they're looking at, what they might be proposing to do, so that employees feel like they're a part of that discussion and they have some sort of insight into what might be happening. And for some employers, that might be simply saying, we're looking at adoption and we don't know what that looks like for us. But it's sharing a part of that journey, I think, with employees, so there can be some transparency and trust. And I think sitting behind that, of course, we need to make sure we have all of the right systems and frameworks in place. So if a potential significant restructure is coming up, we want to make sure we've thought about our consultation obligations. What do our industrial instruments say about that? What do our internal policies or contracts say about that? If we're going to think about changing roles and implementing a change management process, that might warrant reconsideration of hazards that might arise in the sense of psychosocial safety. So how might people be impacted by continuous change? What additional hazards might arise? And so I've been speaking to some clients about the concept of dynamic hazards or emerging hazards. It's not simply the case of doing a risk assessment once and then thinking about it in 12 months' time. Leaders will have to think about these things on the fly as they happen. And sometimes things will happen pretty quickly as things shift in the market and conditions around them. And I think having a really great foundation in place will help leaders, but it's also part of leaders implementing those. So making sure they're trained. And so that's probably a readiness piece that can start to happen now. And then additionally, we're already seeing employers looking at organizational readiness for change. So talking about future state roles, what will that look like? What will grad intakes look like? And I think that thinking is great, and that will help the business start to think about future proofing and what are those skills that we might need. And I think then that can flow on to being really transparent with the workforce about what do we think the skills are once we have that knowledge. So there will no doubt be a lot of anxiety, quite possibly among more junior ranks in organizations at this point in time. And to a degree, that's unavoidable. But I think we can also support them and tell them how we might propose to train them, or how the business might diversify, or what that will look like to the best that we can anticipate.
That's a
And I'm not sure.
fantastic answer. That is a fantastic answer. And you're right, we can't provide all the reassurances. And I think sometimes when we can't, a predisposition is to revert to silence. And silence definitely does not reduce people's anxiety. It only heightens it and their skepticism and cynicism about what's happening. So it's better to say something than nothing, even if you don't have all the answers. Oh, wow. There's so much to discuss. Susie, I want to move back to you now onto the more general environment we're working in and how leaders can best prepare for disruption and managing what is this continuing uncertainty, which we know humans only fear, frankly.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenging time. And I think the great thing about risk is if you can identify a risk, you can manage it. So if we think about it through that lens, there's certainly a lot happening in the economy right now in terms of supply chain disruption due to geopolitical issues and war, fuel shortages, and the subsequent cost pressures that places on both businesses and employees. And I don't think we've ever really seen that before in terms of the range of supply chain pressures on contracts, terms, force majeure, step-in rights, pricing flexibility. Those terms have probably never been more important. We saw a little bit of it back in COVID, but add to that the way that business needs to rapidly evolve to adopt AI to get productivity gains, reduce cost pressures, do more with less, and evolve to automate and get efficiencies using technology. It's certainly a lot for leaders to manage and come to grips with as they lead their staff through that changing world. I think, though, from a governance perspective, this is when we have to connect AI governance to culture, strategy, and risk. As we know, culture is most visible under pressure, and I think boards and management need to be clear on the most significant AI risks or other geopolitical risks to their business, understand how they present in practice, and then be explicit about those behaviours and safeguards that are non-negotiable, while balancing and fostering a culture of innovation, transparency, and accountability, which includes the exciting take-up of new technologies from a positive spin perspective. But the reality is that business leaders and staff, if they don't lean into these new technologies and deal with the current geopolitical and economic environment, their competitors will, and they'll be struggling to catch up with those businesses who do effectively adopt those new technologies for competitive advantage.
Emily, I'm just going to go to you for one final question on people. We've talked about it generally, but a bit more specifically in terms of practical tips that employers and leaders can adopt to help employees through these times from a psychosocial point of view in particular.
Yeah, sure. So I think that when we're having the discussion either at management level or board level about what the changes might be resulting from AI or the implementation of AI, that's a great time to also have a conversation about organizational readiness and how we can prepare for that. So we can start planning now around things like HR resourcing, do we have the right capability and skill set to roll out a change management process? Do we have the right frameworks in place? And then from a psychosocial perspective, I think we can start almost conducting a new risk assessment to say, as we roll this out, does this present new hazards and how can we ensure that our people are safe with us on this journey? Keeping in mind, it's a particular time of uncertainty. It's a particular time, I think, of anxiety in terms of world market and conflicts and supply issues and economic impacts. People are, to a large degree, experiencing a permanent state of anxiety and disruption in their personal life. And I think if we add to that an overlay of potentially losing their livelihood or what they feel like is their career and not knowing where they might be next year or even 5 years away, for some people, they'll have a huge reaction to that and some people will have a smaller reaction to that. But I think carrying an awareness of that and making sure our leaders in our businesses are equipped to deal with that and those different reactions. So having a think about what might the impacts be on our team and how can we support those? So not simply ticking a box to say, yes, we've consulted and then I issued a letter, but how can I meaningfully support that team member through that change? So what in a psychosocial safety context, we'd talk about control design. So what controls can we put in place to mitigate those risks? But a lot of it also comes down to common sense and how can we equip our leaders to support our people when they go through those changes, which can be really distressing for them, both in a professional and a personal sense.
That's so true. That's so true. Susie, I'm going to finish up with you as the queen of demystifying the complex that we've talked about a lot today. What are your 3 top tips to empower leaders and boards, just with some practical takeaways to take back to their business?
Gosh, there's so many tips, isn't there, that we could share, but if I narrow it down to 3, let's give it a go. First of all, AI should augment, not replace human judgment. I think that's a really key takeaway. When you look at your staff and their AI training, when you're refining procedures, we talk about that human in the loop as the critical risk management piece, thinking about your director duties and the weight of decisions that boards and businesses must make. They really demand that careful human judgment, which can be enhanced but not replaced by AI. Secondly, from an operational and risk management perspective, preparing that tailored AI governance and use policy and procedure. It's the one guardrail you can put in and implement in your business to cover all those risks that we talked about earlier, from confidentiality, privilege, privacy, cyber, IP, risks of bias and hallucination or attribution, to create that transparency in your business and really paying attention to the detail of your technology contracts, what's in the fine print around some of those AI solutions, and how can you risk manage and get some contractual protection as to how AI is used and implemented into your business and how that protects your data, your privacy position, and your cyber security risk profile as well. And finally, from a board perspective, you have to have AI firmly on the board agenda and your organisation's risk matrix as well. I talk about the mindset, skill set, tool set framework at a board level. So from a mindset perspective, directors risk missing the opportunity and the strategic implications of AI and underestimating those risks of inaction if they don't develop an AI first mindset. So leaning in, basically, that's your mindset. Skill set, directors have to be able to ask the right questions, understand AI's risks and write effective prompts if they are using AI and appropriate tools, and the tool set, of course. So using the right tools for the right use cases for your business in a way that is secure and strategically sound. How's that?
Absolutely love that. And you knew I would. Look how happy you look. You're so proud of yourself. Mindset, skill set, tool set. I'm taking that away with me. I've never heard that before. And I am grateful for your responses and your contribution. Thank you so much, Susie and Emily, for these great insights. And more importantly, the practical solutions that I'm sure our listeners would be very grateful for. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions or want to chat about anything we've covered in this episode or our series. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.